Study
and play come together on a Windows 11 PC.
And for a limited time, college students get
The best of both worlds.
Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Welcome to Her Extraordinary Life by Design, where we celebrate women who are shaping their lives one extraordinary day at a time. I'm your host, Leslie Gaudet, self-care coach for women who are ready to make self-care a priority to support them in life and business. Every week, I'll be speaking with inspiring women from various walks of life who will share their personal journeys and will discover how they have fearlessly carved their own paths as business owners, passionately pursuing their dreams and creating a meaningful impact on their communities. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to Extraordinary Life by Design podcast. I'm your host, Leslie Gaudet, and today I want to talk about something that I think is sitting underneath a lot of the conversations that high-achieving women are having, but not quite getting to the root of. And it has to do with decisions, not the mechanics of how you make them, not a framework or process or a better way to weigh your options, but something that I believe lives much closer than any of that, something that goes a little bit deeper. So, before we go anywhere today, I want you to think about a recent decision that you made. Something that was significant, the kind that required your time or your money, your energy, your reputation, your hopes, your trust in yourself. And maybe it didn't go the way that you had expected. And I want you to also think about what happened after, because I'm not talking about what happened with the decision. I'm talking about what happened inside you once you moved forward with the decision, and the hours or days or weeks after the outcome landed differently than you had planned. Because here's what I've noticed. When a decision doesn't go the way you expect it to, what I'm finding is that we don't just evaluate the decision, we evaluate ourselves. And sometimes the evaluation isn't kind, probably most times. It doesn't always sound like, okay, that didn't work out the way I'd hoped. What can I take away from this? And what do I do next? No, it doesn't sound like that at all, does it? If we're being honest with ourselves, it sounds more like, what does this say about me? Like about whether I actually know what I'm doing, about whether I can be trusted to choose correctly. Because somewhere in that evaluation, in that moment of sitting with an outcome that didn't match the expectation, a verdict gets reached. Not about the decision, but about you, about what you make it mean about you. And here's what I want you to really hear today. That verdict, the one that you reached in that painful moment while you were still inside the disappointment, when you've been in those moments and it starts to feel like a pattern, what you start doing is that you start treating the meaning that you make about yourself as fact, not as a conclusion drawn from one experience in one moment, but as fact, as something true and permanent about who you are and how reliably that you can be trusted to make the right call moving forward. And I want to challenge that, not because disappointment isn't real or that decisions don't cost you something, but because the meaning that you assigned to the outcome in that moment and the conclusion that you drew about yourself because of it may not be nearly as true as it felt when you were sitting inside the disappointment. In fact, I bet it's not true at all, especially when it's laced with negative self-talk. And that's the part I want to talk about today. Not the decisions that you make, but the verdicts that you reach about yourself in the aftermath, and why that verdict may be shaping far more of your decision-making than you realize. So let me paint a picture for you about a woman. She's not a specific person, but she's real in the way that composite portraits are real. built from patterns that I've seen enough times to know that she exists. And I want you to notice something as I describe her, because I think that somewhere in this story, you may recognize parts of yourself that you've never really fully stopped to examine before. This woman I'm introducing you to, she's not someone who struggles with decision. Let me be clear about that from the start. She makes complex decisions regularly, under pressure, with real stakes attached to them, in her work, in her business, in the environments that she navigates every single day. She's the one that other people come to when something needs to be figured out. She's competent, she's capable. And yet there's a specific kind of decision, the ones that matter most, that have a lot riding on them, the ones where the stakes feel the highest, the ones that require something significant, where a pattern kicks in that she hasn't been able to name, where she starts internally negotiating with herself, trying to determine which part of herself is actually safer to trust. The logical part that says, okay, slow down, think clearly, look at the facts, don't let emotion cloud this, or the emotional part that says, hey, you've analyzed this enough already. You know when something feels right. Stop overthinking it. And underneath both of those voices is the same question. Which of these is less likely to lead me into another disappointing outcome? You see, somewhere along the way, as life kept on lifing, she absorbed something about what good decision making is supposed to look like, that is either logical or it's emotional, that a clear headed decision is one where you set aside how you feel and you follow what the data tells you, or that an aligned decision is one where you stop overthinking and you go with what feels right. And that mixing the two, letting logic and emotion sit at the same table at the same time, is a sign that she hasn't thought it through clearly enough, that it means she's confused or she's compromising or she's not as decisive as she's supposed to be. So she picks a lane, just one every time, logic or emotion, data or feeling, head or heart, never both. And then a decision comes along that doesn't go the way she expects, a business decision, an investment, a partnership, a direction that she's committed to that didn't deliver what she'd been counting on. Maybe a hire that didn't work out, a strategy that fell flat, an opportunity that she said yes to that cost her more than it returned. Really, the specifics don't really matter as much as what happened in the aftermath. Because in the aftermath, she didn't just evaluate the decision, she went back through every step of how she made the decision, trying to locate where she went wrong, eventually landing in one of two conclusions. Either I ignored what I was feeling and I relied too heavily on logic, or I let emotion lead and overrode what the facts were trying to show me. Either way, the outcome became evidence that one part of herself shouldn't have been trusted. And that's when the verdict arrives. Not about the decision, but about her, pitting emotion against logic. If I'd been thinking more clearly, I would have caught this. Or if I trusted what I was feeling instead of overanalyzing it, I would have known. Or if I'd been less emotional about it and I looked at the numbers first, I would have seen the signs. And underneath all of those specific conclusions, one sits beneath all of them. I don't know how to make the right call when it actually matters. And that verdict reached in the middle of a disappointing outcome in a moment when she was already questioning everything. She carried that forward into the next decision and the one after that, and so on. So that the next time a significant decision arrived, she approached it differently, second guessing the logical case because last time logic had let her down, or second guessing the feeling because last time emotion had gotten in the way. And she went back and forth between the two, looking for the right one to trust, waiting for one of them to feel certain enough to act on. But think about this. Think about the last significant decision that you made that didn't land the way you expected, the kind that cost you something, whether that was money or time or even both. And think about what you told yourself afterwards about how you made that choice to move forward. Did you conclude that you'd been too logical or too emotional? That you should have thought more carefully or felt more clearly or trusted one thing over the other? And has that conclusion changed how you've approached decisions since then? Like, are you second guessing yourself, the logical case, more than you used to? Or are you dismissing what you feel because last time the feeling led you somewhere that didn't work out? Because if either of those things is true, then the conclusion that you reach from that one experience may still be shaping the way that you relate to decisions now, not as information, not as wisdom, but more as a permanent interpretation of what it means when you trust yourself and the outcome still doesn't go the way that you planned. And if you recognize yourself in the woman who goes back through every step of how she makes decisions, looking for all the places where she went wrong, I want you to stick with me because today I want to get to what I believe is actually happening. So, first thing I want to look at is the pattern that says decisions have to come from logic or emotion, not both, that it has to be one or the other. And I want to examine where that came from because you didn't make it up. It came from somewhere, right? From environments that rewarded a certain kind of decision making and penalized another, from watching what happens when women in professional spaces lead with feeling rather than data, or from learning that the most credible, most competent, and most respected version of yourself is the one who keeps emotion out of it. And I want to look at why that pattern, however you came to that conclusion, however understandable it feels for you, I want to look at how it's been keeping you from the fullest relationship with trusting your own decision making, from being able to trust that you know what you know, no matter the outcome. So that's first. And then because most conversations about decision making focus on the decision itself, was it the right call? What should you have done differently? How do you avoid making the same mistake next time? I'm not going to focus on that because I don't believe that that's where the real cost lives. I believe that the real cost lives in what happens after the decision and what you decide that the outcome means, not about the decision, but about you, about your competence, your credibility, your identity as someone who's supposed to know what she's doing. And when decisions start carrying that kind of identity weight, this is where you'll often find yourself over managing the process of decision making itself, trying to reduce uncertainty, trying to avoid getting it wrong, trying to protect yourself from what another disappointing outcome might mean about you. And I want to name the difference between learning from an outcome and turning the outcome into evidence against yourself. Because one deepens your wisdom, right? But the other erodes your trust. That's the second lens. And then finally, I want to talk about something I think that a lot of conversations about self trust miss because they focus on confidence or being more decisive or trusting your gut. But I'm not going there either because what I want to talk about is something more specific. I want to talk about what it actually means to trust yourself to make the decisions, even the ones that don't pan out the way that you hoped they would, and not the certainty that you'll always get it right, but something I think is both more honest and more useful than certainty ever could be. And I want to introduce you to an idea that might feel counterintuitive at first, because I believe that logic and emotion were never supposed to compete with each other, that the outcome of a decision and the quality of a decision are two completely different things. And that sometimes, even when the decision didn't go the way that you planned, that it was doing something for you that a perfect outcome never could have. So that's the third lens. And so I encourage you to stay with me because I think this final lens changes the way that we've been taught to interpret decisions, disappointment, and what those outcomes mean about us. So let's stay with this for a moment. Because I think if most women were asked how they make important decisions, they would probably tell you that they're thoughtful about them, that they think things through. They weigh the options, they look at the facts, they consider the implications, they try to make responsible decisions with the information that they have available at the time. And none of that is wrong. But I think there's something else happening underneath that process that often only becomes visible after the outcome is revealed. Because when a decision carries real weight, whether your time, your money, your reputation, your future, your emotional investment, you don't experience yourself as consciously choosing between logic and emotion. You're not sitting there thinking, should I trust the facts or should I trust what I feel? That's usually not how it happens. What usually happens is that you move towards the decision the way you always have, the way that feels most familiar to you, most natural, most convincing in the moment. And sometimes that process leans more heavily on analysis, the data, the strategy, the practical case you built for why something makes sense. And the emotional response, the hesitation, the pull, the internal reaction, that's also carrying information that gets pushed further into the background. Not because you're ignoring yourself, but because something else feels more reliable in that moment, in the logical state, right? But then sometimes the opposite happens. The internal knowing feels so strong that you've moved towards it before fully interrogating the facts. The resonance feels clear. The direction feels right. The logical questions that might have slowed the process down get softened around the edges because something in you already wants to move. And usually, while you're inside the decision itself, none of this feels obvious because you're just deciding the way you always decide. But when the outcome lands differently than you expect it to, suddenly the review process begins because you go back through every conversation, you go back through every detail, every moment of hesitation, every signal you now think you should have noticed sooner. Not just trying to understand what happened, but trying to locate where you went wrong. And this is where the pattern underneath all of this starts becoming more visible because hindsight creates a kind of clarity that doesn't exist in real time, right? Because once the outcome's known, the missed signal suddenly looks obvious. The data point feels more important than it seemed at the time. And the hesitation feels louder in retrospect to what it did in the actual moment. And eventually the review lands somewhere. Maybe in I relied too heavily on logic and I ignored what I was feeling, or I let my emotions lead and I overrode what the facts were trying to show me. Either way, the outcome becomes evidence that one part of yourself should have been trusted more than the other. And underneath that conclusion is something even heavier. Not that decisions that you make don't work, but that there's something flawed in the way that you make decisions. And that's the part I think that many women never really fully stop to examine because it doesn't initially feel like self doubt. It feels more like responsibility, like maturity, like learning from experience, like you're trying to become someone who makes better calls moving forward. But over time, something begins shifting in the relationship that you have with your own decision making, right? With your own knowing. There's more hesitation than there used to be, more internal negotiation, more reviewing, more pressure to get it right before moving. Not because you suddenly became incapable of making decisions, but because disappointing outcomes started carrying identity weight. And once that happens, decisions stop being only about the decision itself because now they also carry the emotional risk of what will this mean about me if this goes wrong again? And that changes the experience of making decisions entirely, right? Because now you're no longer just trying to make a thoughtful choice, like trying to make a thoughtful decision. You're actually trying to avoid another outcome that reinforces the conclusion that you're already afraid might be true about yourself. And that's the part underneath all of this, I think, that gets overlooked. Not just how do I make better decisions, but what if I started believing about myself because some of my decisions didn't turn out the way that I had hoped? And the thing is, most women never realize just how much a disappointing outcome has actually changed the way they move through how they choose and decide. Because from the outside, they look like themselves. They still feel like themselves. They're still capable. They're functioning at a high level. They're still making things happen and they're handling things. They're handling what needs to get handled. But internally, something has started to change. Something about the experience of deciding no longer feels the same. Because once you've lived through a decision that cost you something significant, you don't approach the next important decision with the same nervous system that you had before it happened. And I don't think women talk enough about that, about what it actually does to you when you trusted yourself, right? You moved forward, you committed, you invested, you believed in something. And then you found yourself standing in the aftermath holding consequences that you never saw coming. Not just disappointment, but frustration, the money that you invested, the money that didn't come back if you felt like you didn't get what you actually paid for, the time that you can't recover, the mental replaying, the realization that even after everything, you still didn't end up where you thought you would. And that changes something, right? Because the next time an opportunity appears, whether it's a major investment, a partnership, a direction that requires trust, you notice yourself needing something you didn't used to need to the same degree before, needing more reassurance, more certainty, more evidence that this time you're seeing the whole picture clearly. And you tell yourself, I'm just being smarter now, more informed, more thorough. But underneath all the thoroughness is often something much harder to admit that you're trying to protect yourself from having to feel what you felt the last time a decision blindsided you. And that changes the experience of making decisions completely because now you're no longer just deciding about the opportunity itself. You're also trying to manage the emotional risk attached to what happens if the outcome disappoints you again, taking you down a whole rabbit hole of questions of what if I miss something important again? What if I trust the wrong thing again or the wrong person? What if I move forward confidently and I still end up on the other side asking myself how I didn't see it sooner? You see, here's what I want you to understand. High achieving women become very good at disguising this internal shift as discernment, as strategy, as maturity, as being careful. But internally, the process often ends up feeling very different, heavier, more mentally consuming, less clean. Because there's a difference between thoughtful decision making and trying to emotionally future proof yourself against disappointment, right? And I think many women don't realize just how much energy they're spending trying to reduce the emotional exposure attached to making an important decision. And over time, that changes the rhythm of how a woman moves through her life because she takes longer to trust herself, longer to commit to something, longer to move, longer to relax after a decision has already been made. Because now every major decision carries another layer underneath it. And honestly, that's exhausting to go through life this way. Because eventually the pressure stops living only inside the decision itself and it starts living inside what the outcome might mean about you, about your judgment, your intelligence, your ability to navigate important things well, your identity as someone who's supposed to know what she's doing by now. And I think this is where the cost becomes expensive. Because, like I said earlier, from the outside, you can still be functioning at a very high level. But internally, you're no longer approaching decisions with the same openness that you once did. There's more guarding now, more scanning, more trying to anticipate what could go wrong before you allow yourself to fully trust what feels right. Because once enough disappointing outcomes attach themselves to moments where you truly thought you were making the right call, you stop relating to your own inner knowing the same way. And when you lose access to that distinction, some part of you is no longer only evaluating the opportunity itself, but you start evaluating whether you can emotionally afford another outcome that leaves you questioning yourself afterward. And even if right now you're listening to this and you're thinking, no, I don't do that, I can tell you this is real because I've experienced it myself. And I also know incredibly successful, thoughtful, emotionally intelligent women who've experienced this as well. And I think that's the part that we often never say, that after certain disappointments, it's not always the outcome itself that lingers the longest. Sometimes it's the way that we second guess ourselves afterwards, the way that hesitation starts to show up, even around things that genuinely feel right, the way that you stop trusting what you know internally because past disappointment taught you that feeling certain about something doesn't guarantee the outcome that you hope for. And the accumulation of hesitation, of internal negotiation, of reviewing and then re reviewing, of trying to feel completely certain, trying to eliminate uncertainty before allowing yourself to move, that can change something in you over time. Not because you're weak but because somewhere along the way, decisions stop feeling like moments to move through and they started feeling like moments that could leave you questioning whether you truly know what you're doing. And I think eventually you reach a point where you realize something's going on and you're not sure if the issue was the disappointing outcome or what happened afterward. And I want to say that I believe it's that self trust piece, right? Because after enough experiences where something didn't go the way that you hoped it would, the way you planned for, you stop approaching how you make your choices, right? You stop approaching decisions with the same internal steadiness because somewhere along the way, you started treating painful outcomes like they were saying something final about you, about who you are, about your judgment, your intelligence, your ability to trust yourself to make the right choice. And honestly, I think this is where the possibility for a different relationship with decision making can begin. But it's not about suddenly becoming fearless or that every future decision will work out perfectly or that uncertainty will miraculously disappear. Because we know that's not how life works, right? What I do believe, though, is that when you start to recognize that disappointing outcomes were never proof that there's something fundamentally flawed in you, that's when you can understand that outcomes were never supposed to become identity verdicts in the first place. Because I know that you probably think that after enough disappointing outcomes, after enough moments where the result didn't match what you hoped or expected or believed would happen, that the evidence can start to feel stacked against you, right? And that somewhere along the way, you began collapsing three separate things into one: the decision, the outcome, and what the outcome means about you. Because when a decision doesn't work out, it makes you feel like the decision itself must have been wrong, which slowly turned to maybe I was wrong for trusting myself in the first place. And that interpretation can happen fast, so fast that you might not even realize you're doing it. It just starts to feel true. But here's the thing: A decision can be thoughtful, it can be honest and grounded and made from the best information available at the time, and it can still lead to an outcome that you never could have fully predicted because outcomes are influenced by things that you can't control. Timing, people, information that you didn't have at the time, things that only became visible afterwards. And I think that once you begin separating those things, the decision and the outcome and the meaning that you attach to yourself because of an outcome, when you can do that, now the outcome becomes information, right? Not identity evidence. You see, when you lose trust in whichever part of yourself you blamed for a disappointing outcome, where the outcome hurt you, and you told yourself that you ignored what you were feeling, that you knew that there were signs, that something inside you was trying to get your attention and you overrode it, or you landed in the opposite conclusion, that you let yourself get emotionally attached, that you wanted something badly enough that you stopped looking clearly at what was actually in front of you without fully realizing it, you start treating logic and emotion like opposing forces inside you. Like one was responsible for protecting you and the other was responsible for getting you hurt. But they were never supposed to work against each other. That's what I'm trying to say. Logic was never meant to silence what you were feeling, and emotion was never meant to override reality. They're designed to inform each other because your logical mind notices things, right? Patterns, details, inconsistencies, practical implications. And your emotional experience notices things like tension, resonance, hesitation, the internal response you feel before you fully have language for why you're feeling it. What I'm trying to say is that mature decision making was never supposed to require you to amputate one part of yourself in order to trust the other. It was supposed to allow both forms of information into the room at the same time, not one overpowering the other, but both informing the decision together. Because when you really look back and you can take an honest look, some of the decisions that looked completely right on paper, they still didn't feel right somewhere inside of you. And some of the decisions that made very little logical sense initially ended up changing your life in ways you never could have predicted. Because you're not moving through life as a detached observer. At least I hope that that's not what you're doing. I hope that you're moving through your relationships, your opportunities, your disappointments, your hopes, instincts, your fears, your timing, your pressure, lived experiences all at the same time. And when you start distrusting one part of yourself completely because of a painful outcome, you can start losing trust in yourself in other areas of your life too. And so I think for many women, when it comes to trusting themselves to make decisions, this can be their first real release, where in the moment that you stop asking, should I trust logic or emotion? And you start to understand that healthy judgment was never supposed to require you to portray either one. Because sometimes a decision can be imperfect, right? And still move your life in a direction that revealed something important that you would not have seen otherwise. Sometimes the investment that disappointed you exposed questions that you now know to ask that you may never have considered before. And sometimes an opportunity that didn't become what you'd hoped, it still brought you closer to the kind of life that you actually want to build. You see, I believe that the deepest part of the shift can happen when you stop asking, was it the right decision? And you start asking, what became visible to me because of that decision that I couldn't see before? What did it show me about myself, about what mattered to me, about what I ignored, about what I now know, about what I knew deep down, but I kept talking myself out of? And listen, sometimes the decisions that hurt you the most sometimes end up being the ones that clarified something you would never again be willing to negotiate away. Like one of the things that Tom Brady said, yes, I'm quoting Tom Brady. One of the things that he said in an interview that I watched was that all those experiences that we think are the hardest things in our life end up being the best experience in our life because if you approach it with humility and you look inward, they become the best opportunities for growth and learning. And I believe that, and that's stuck with me ever since I heard him say that. And I want you to know that I'm not saying that what you experienced was painless or that you wanted the outcome or that you would choose the pain again. What I'm saying is that disappointment doesn't automatically make a decision meaningless. And sometimes a decision that didn't end the way that you hoped still revealed something important that you needed to see. And I think that when you begin looking at decisions this way, not only through the lens of whether the outcome matched what you hoped for, but also through the lens of what the experience revealed, what it clarified or shifted inside of you. It can change the entire conversation about how you approach your decisions. Because now the goal changes from becoming someone who never makes the wrong decision, and it becomes learning how to move through your decisions fully, learning from what follows honestly, and no longer turning every painful outcome into evidence against yourself. Because self trust is not built by avoiding disappointment. It's built when you finally understand that no single outcome has the authority to define your intelligence, your capability, your judgment, or your worth. I think one of the hardest things about disappointing outcomes is that the moment itself eventually ends, but the internal review of it doesn't always stop, right? Because a decision gets made, the outcome plays out, life moves forward, but your mind keeps returning to it. Because you hear someone talking about taking a big leap, and before you even have a conscious thought about it, something inside you tightens, remembering the last time you fully trusted yourself and the outcome didn't unfold the way you hoped. Someone presents you with an opportunity. Before you even realize it's happening, your mind starts pulling old evidence files. Or you sit down to make another significant decision, and suddenly you feel the weight of needing to get this one right in a way that you didn't before you stopped fully trusting yourself. And what's interesting about this is that you don't even realize you're still in conversation with the old decision because you think you're responding to what's in front of you right now. But underneath the current decision is often another one entirely, an older one that still hasn't fully released its grip. Because when we're honest with ourselves, we realize and we understand that there are decisions that we move on from, and then there are decisions that we keep revisiting long after they're over. Not necessarily because we're still evaluating the situation, but more because some part of us is still trying to determine what the outcome means about us, right? What it meant about us. And that's what I want you to sit with today. Not the decision that still lingers, not whether it worked out or whether someone else would agree with how you handled it. I want you to think about that decision that you still mentally return to, the one that still gets referenced internally whenever another important choice appears, the one that changed the way you approach risk, the way you approach trust, timing, commitment, movement. And I want you to notice when your mind goes back there, what exactly is it still trying to solve? Are you actually trying to understand how you make decisions better? Or are you stuck in the loop of trying to understand the outcomes and what you make them mean about you? Because I think, as a high achieving woman, that if you've ever felt this way, then you most likely have spent years unknowingly replaying decisions that were never actually about the decision anymore. They became identity references, evidence files, moments that you use to measure your judgment, your capability, your ability to trust yourself under pressure. And over time, that creates patterns around hesitation, around overchecking, around needing more time before committing, around mentally rehearsing every possible outcome before moving forward, and patterns around trying to reduce uncertainty to a level that life was never going to give you in the first place. And although those patterns feel like you're being responsible, strategic, and measured, internally they often feel exhausting because there's a difference between thoughtful decision making and carrying the emotional residue of an old outcome into every new decision that follows. So I want to leave you with something to consider today. What decision have you been using as evidence against yourself? And how much of your current decision making process has been shaped by what you made that outcome mean about you? Not what happened, but what you made it mean about you as a person. Because I think that that distinction can change more than you realize. And sometimes simply noticing the pattern is enough to start seeing yourself and your decisions differently. I think one of the things that makes conversations like this so difficult to have is that a lot of the time we're carrying decisions that we believe we should have already made peace with by now, especially as high achieving women who are used to being capable, competent, steady, ones that people look to when something important needs to be figured out. Because once you become known as that person, the woman who knows how to navigate hard things, it becomes difficult to admit when a decision shook you more than you expected it to. Again, not because you're incapable, but because once people experience you as someone who's steady, thoughtful, and capable under pressure, it becomes difficult to reveal the moments that challenge your trust in yourself more deeply than anyone realizes. And I think that that kind of pressure changes the conversation women are actually willing to have because there's a difference between discussing a decision once you've fully processed it and being able to speak honestly about it while you're still sitting inside the complexity of it, while you're still sorting through what happened, what it taught you, what it changed in you, what you're still trying to understand, and what you're making it mean about you. And I think for many women, there's a hesitation around speaking honestly about these experiences because so many of the spaces they move through were never really designed to hold conversations at this level of honesty, not professionally, socially or even personally sometimes, which is one of the reasons why I've been building something behind the scenes that feels deeply connected to providing that space, especially after everything that we've talked about today. Something I'm currently calling the Faceless and Nameless Gatherings. And the idea is simple: no faces, no names, no titles, no professional identities to manage, just voices in the room holding space for one another. A space where women can speak openly and honestly about the things they've been carrying without the pressure of needing to appear certain while they're speaking. A space where a woman doesn't have to worry about how what she says will sound like to colleagues, to clients, to peers, to friends, people who know her professionally. Because I think that many women are exhausted from always being perceived while they're processing. And sometimes what's needed isn't more advice. It's simply a place, a room where you can finally say the true thing without feeling like it has to become part of your professional identity afterwards, especially conversations like this one. Conversations about decisions, self trust, regret, discernment, second guessing, decisions that changed us, the ones we still revisit, the ones we learned from but still carry pieces of that are attached to our identity. A space where it's being a human trying to understand our own lives honestly while we're still living inside our lives, right? And if listening to this episode felt personal for you in some way, if you recognized yourself somewhere inside this conversation, I'd love to know whether a space like this is something you'd want to be a part of, because I have a feeling there's a lot more women carrying conversations like this privately than anyone realizes. So if this speaks to you, send me an email. You'll find my email in the show notes, and just send me a simple yes to the gatherings. That's it. No long explanation needed. But if you want to send me a nice long email, I will appreciate that as well. But I'm just saying, just say yes to the gatherings, because I think a lot of women, they're looking for the same thing right now, right? Somewhere where we can finally exhale long enough to hear ourselves think again. So there's one last thing I want to leave you with today before you go. And it's this: I think many high achieving women have spent years unknowingly approaching decisions like courtroom proceedings, gathering evidence, building cases, reviewing outcomes, cross examining themselves afterwards, trying to determine whether the result proves that they can trust themselves to choose correctly. And after a while, decision making stops feeling like movement and it starts to feel like self protection. Not because you've become incapable, but because every disappointing outcome starts carrying a lot more weight than the decision itself. It becomes evidence, a reference point, a story about what kind of judgment that you have, what kind of woman you are under pressure, whether you should have known better. And what I hope this conversation gave you today is the understanding that decisions were never meant to carry that kind of emotional burden. Because the goal was never perfection. It was never to become a woman who flawlessly predicts outcomes before they happen. That woman doesn't exist. Not in business, not in leadership, not in relationships, not in life anywhere. Not anywhere. The real goal has always been something much more human than that: to make the best decision available to you with what you know at the time, using both your thinking and your lived experience, both your analysis and your internal knowing, without requiring certainty before you allow yourself to move, and being okay even if you don't always get it right, and then to meet the outcome honestly, without rewriting your entire identity around it if it disappoints you. Because I think there's a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly feeling like every decision is secretly evaluating your worth. Like one wrong move might expose something about you that you've worked very hard to prove isn't true. And women who live inside that pressure long enough start approaching decisions differently. The decisions become heavy before they've even been made, not because she's not capable of deciding, but because she's no longer deciding only about the opportunity in front of her. She's also trying to protect herself from what another painful outcome might make her feel about herself. And that changes the experience of moving through life. Because now every made decision carries two layers: the actual decision itself and the emotional risk of self judgment attached to the outcome. But the women whose judgment deepens over time, the women who've become steadier, wiser, clearer in themselves as the years go on, they're not women who avoid every mistake. They learned how to stay in relationship with themselves after a mistake. You see, women who can say, that hurt, that cost me something, that mattered, I wish that parts of it had gone differently, and still not turn the experience into a permanent conclusion about their intelligence, their capability, their judgment, or their value, they become women who can hold disappointment without collapsing their entire sense of self inside it. Because there's a difference between learning from a decision and sentencing yourself for it. And I think many women have learned how to evaluate outcomes but not how to stay connected to themselves in the aftermath of disappointment without turning the experience into self-condemnation. So maybe what matters isn't becoming someone who always gets it right, but instead becoming someone who can make the call, live the experience, extract the insight, and adjust when necessary. And then to continue moving through life without carrying every past outcome as evidence against themselves. Because that kind of self-trust can create a steadiness that can't be manufactured through certainty, only through lived experience, honestly met. And over time, I think that's where wisdom often gets built, not by avoiding mistakes, but by allowing life to refine you without allowing it to reduce you. Thanks for spending time with me today. I hope you got value from today's conversation. I truly do. And I'm looking forward to hearing from those of you who are interested in the gatherings, because I think that will be an incredible experience, one that I'm looking forward to having alongside you. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And until next time, keep dreaming, keep believing, and keep designing your extraordinary life one day at a time.
Thank you for joining me on Her Extraordinary Life by Design. I hope you've been inspired and empowered by the incredible stories shared on this show. If you enjoyed this episode and the conversations we've had, I would greatly appreciate if you could take a moment to leave a review. Your feedback and support mean the world to me, and it will help others discover the podcast and join our empowering community. Remember to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Together, we can continue to learn from these amazing women, uncover their extraordinary journeys, and be motivated to create our own lives by design. Thank you again for tuning in. Until next time, stay empowered and keep shaping your extraordinary life one day at a time.